Hi. In this video, I want to explore this concept of how we might use Paul's missionary model in evaluating and assessing both some other historical models of missions as well as contemporary issues that are coming up in missions. If you've not been following this series, then I don't know that you can follow this that well, because I'm not going to summarize all that we've done in dozens of videos. And I'm not going to answer everything that we might attempt to answer, perhaps, about contemporary or even historical models. I'm just raising this idea that I believe personally, my personal conviction is that Paul is the best assessment tool that we could possibly have to look at missions historically and in our contemporary world. And so we're just going to walk through some examples of those today without answering everything. We're not going to try to make every application. Just, again, the idea that Paul can offer us so much guidance to assessing what's happening in missions. And I think we really need some assessment guide today, because there's just so many things that are taking place that are, well, to be honest, are just really not that effective. And I think Paul provides us a better way. So let's just start with the most common mistake that I see. And that is we have Paul's mission team. He's the leader of the team, and yet there are a lot of independent pieces of it working around. And as Paul describes it, they have an apostolic calling. They're called to be sent ones. This is, in Paul's view, a temporary ministry. Paul doesn't move to Corinth or Antioch or anywhere else and stay 30 years as the pastor of a church. That's not the missionary model that we have in the New Testament. And as he describes it repeatedly, his role and the role of these missionaries is to lay the foundation of a church. It's to go where there is no foundation and share the gospel, make disciples, and lay the foundation of the church. And then start pulling back, because now that church is going to be functioning on its own. The missionary is not the bishop. He does watch over the gospel primarily. But in a mission team today, I think there's pretty close to direct application of Paul's mission model. And I certainly tried to do that. I'm not Paul by any means, but I was trying to do that in my ministry. And then as I coached other missionary teams, I believe the ones that were most focused and effective were following the principles and some of the patterns. They can't do it exactly. I mean, we're not 2,000 years ago. Now, when we try to apply this in the local church, and a lot of my students raise this issue when they study with me, well, how can we do this exactly in the church? I said, well, okay, let's just start with this realization that there are major differences. The primary calling in the local church is pastoral calling, and we want to emphasize the pastor. Paul was not a pastor, and his ministry is not. Now, he is pastoral, but he's not a pastor. He is a pioneer, foundation-laying, church planter, evangelist, and discipler. In the local church, we're talking about ongoing ministry. And, we often see great churches that had pastors that stayed 20, 30, or 40 years, and those are often some of the best churches there are. That's just the opposite of Paul. So, again, doesn't quite match up exactly. And in the local church, most of the time we're not laying the foundation, we're building on the foundation. And if the church has been around a while, it might be the second, third, or fourth, or fifth level story built on that foundation that some pioneer laid, in previous years. So I think in terms of applying Paul's model in the local church, we should look for principles. And we should apply them appropriately, but that requires a lot of wisdom, because, again, they're just two different pieces of God's plan for how the church grows. Paul's not a pastor, Now, if we want to see how do you preach the gospel, Paul gives a great example of that, for instance. But in terms of his ministry and so many other things, these are two very distinct phases of church life and ministry, and we need to just recognize that. So I'd like to just walk through a few mission models since 1792, the beginning of the modern missions movement. That's, again, William Carey going out to India and starting the Baptist Missionary Society. And the question is, can Paul's example in the New Testament provide a standard by which we can assess major trends in Protestant missions over the last 200 years? I certainly think so, and I love mission history, and I read it a lot. And so let's start with Carey himself. Carey had been in India a little over 10 years. He now had two co-workers, actually three co-workers there with him in Serampore. And after they had been working together for about 5 years, they sat down and wrote out a covenant, their commitment. It's an expression of their strategy. And it is one of my favorite historical documents. You can find it online. It's incredible to read. The larger document here, I've got it in this very short, simplest form. But here's what they said that they were going to prioritize in their missions work. The first one was to set an infinite value on men's souls. You can do a lot of other things, but if you're not leading men and women to saving faith in Jesus Christ, they're still lost and doomed. And so the Serampore Covenant says, look, we're trying to win people to faith in Jesus Christ. The second one, they said, to acquaint ourselves with the snares which hold the minds of the people. We want to learn their language. We want to talk to the local people. We want to be out witnessing a lot, but we're listening a lot. We want to know, what is it about the way we're presenting the gospel, or even about Jesus himself, that turns people away? And we're not going to change the gospel, but we want to be aware, especially if it's something personal, some food I eat or some way that I express myself that offends local people. I want to avoid that if I possibly can. That's actually quite modern in its thinking, and I think it surprises people who don't realize that even back at the beginning of the Protestant mission movement, that missionaries were aware of these kinds of things and trying to adapt themselves. Then out of that knowledge, to abstain from whatever deepens India's prejudice against the gospel. The most important thing, we saw it in Paul, and now we see it in this group of missionaries, is to get the gospel out and for people to understand it and actually to take off, because now they're sharing the gospel. So there's something in us, in the way we live or how we speak or whatever, that increases the prejudice. Then we're going to do everything we can to avoid those things. To watch for every chance of doing the people good. And Carey and his colleagues did all kinds of good things for the local people, including speaking out against some of the greatest injustices in that society. So they want to show care in very practical ways. It's not the most important thing they're doing, but it is a part of their task. And then to preach Christ crucified. And here they've taken this straight from Paul. As this is the grand means of conversion. If people don't know that Jesus has come to die for their sins and is risen again to give them life, then they're still doomed and lost and separated from God. So this is the message that this team said, okay, we're going to be doing this very thing, preaching the cross and the resurrection. And then, sort of surprising, especially if you hear people talking about missionaries from a secular perspective, like in our universities and places, it's going to be all negative. At a time when the British themselves were not treating Indians as equals, they were trying to subjugate them. These Baptist missionaries says, no, we will esteem and treat Indians as equals, because they are created by God and they are the same as us in every way. They come to faith and they gain salvation exactly like we do. So we're going to treat them socially and every other way as equals. Remember, this is 1804. That's pretty amazing for the time. Then to guard and build up the host that may be gathered. So when they're out preaching Christ crucified and people believe, then this team is going to deeply invest to protect them in any way that they can that's practical, but mostly to build them up, to make them strong disciples and a strong church. And that involves to cultivate their spiritual gifts, ever pressing upon them the missionary obligation, since Indians only can win India for Christ. Now, here, Carey and his friends, they're playing this role of the foundation layer. They have come to bring the gospel from outside. But they know that 999 Indians out of 1,000, if they come to Christ, must come to Christ from other Indian believers. And this idea that Indians only can win India for Christ, I've heard people talk about this as a recent thought or a contemporary value. No, this is 1804. They knew it all along that this small team of less than 10 there in Serampore, we're never going to be able to talk to everybody in India, and that was going to only happen when Indians started using their gifts and expressed their passion for Jesus and the gospel, and more Indians would hear and believe. To labor unceasingly in Bible translation. And they did. This team produced thousands of Bibles in dozens of languages. And a lot of the work, Carey would come in from, he had a full-time job, and he would come home at night, and then he would sit down for 3, 4, 5 hours and work on translating the Bible into one of the major Indian languages, because they knew that without the Bible, it's really hard to, it's much harder to develop leaders and to make sure that people understand the faith, and that this is not becoming syncretism. For instance, the Bible is the guard against so much of that. And so this team really focused. They're strong biblical conservatives, and they wanted to put a Bible in the hands of every believer, and then in some cases in the hands of those who haven't yet believed. Now, in order to carry out this task, they knew, they used an interesting term that we wouldn't use this way today, to be instant in the nurture of personal religion. What they're talking about here is we're going to make sure that we stay very close to the heart of Jesus Christ. We're going to be reading the Bible for ourselves. We're going to be in constant prayer, and this is going to be a part of our daily routine. Our own spiritual life has to be fresh in order for us to listen to God and to be used by God. So again, the terms are a little bit outdated, but certainly the concept we catch and understand. And then the last, the 11th of the commitments was to give ourselves without reserve to the cause. And these 3 men did absolutely that. They worked themselves. Carey worked 17-hour days according to his diaries. The other men worked very long hours. And they gave themselves until they died to bring the gospel to as many people as possible. Now, when I read this, the first time I read this, I thought, oh my goodness, this is so much better missiology than what I read in later documents and in later patterns of mission that developed decades after this. And you think, well, how did they get that? Well, I know from reading a lot of books on Carey and some of his diaries that Carey was consciously trying to follow Paul. That's why this lines up, and he even uses Pauline terminology in some of these statements. The one that's a little different is the Bible translation, because Paul's working at a time when probably the Gospels aren't even written or just started to be written down. Paul certainly used the Old Testament, especially with Jewish believers, but so this is a little bit different, but I think that's Paul. In today's world, I believe Paul would be doing the same thing, making sure that he is bringing the message, and he has it in a scripture that he can give to people in a language that makes sense to them, because Paul's trying to do that verbally all the time. Preach to Jews maybe in Aramaic, or preach to Greeks certainly in Greek. So again, I think this is one of the most forward-looking missiological strategies or commitments or covenants, as they called it. And I believe it comes largely from the influence of the Pauline model in the New Testament. Well, that changed as missions started to develop, and more people started going out as missionaries, especially from, I would say, more established churches than Baptists. Baptists were small, and they were known as nonconformists because they believed that the Bible should be the guide and not tradition of a denomination. But other denominations, especially the more established, and the state churches started getting involved. And actually, missions changed a lot within a generation of Cary. You see, 1804 for Serampore. Now, by the 1840s, we're seeing very different forms of missions developing. So by the mid-1800s, many missionaries saw their work as bringing civilization to the natives around the world. And this was especially true of state churches, and you can see why. If back home they're part of a state church where the church is supported by the taxes of the people in that area, and the pastors get their salaries from the local government or whatever, then in order to extend that model to other nations, you sort of have to develop the whole system. And so this is very different from how Cary and Adoniram Judson and others, especially the nonconformists like Baptists, who weren't seeing we're going to go set up a state church, because that's not in the New Testament. But now missionaries sent by a state church are thinking that way. And so the political colonizers, or we might say the financial colonizers, like the East India Company, the Dutch East Indies Company, mostly just wanted to exploit those people for either raw resources or for cheap labor. But these Christian missionaries usually cared about the people and wanted to help them. And so through charity, they tried to share the best of their culture and knowledge. And so around the world today, we see education, medicine, so many fields that have helped people in multiple countries actually was started by missionaries, and most of those countries will acknowledge this. The first hospitals, the first schools in so many countries around the world, non-Christian countries, were started by missionaries, and these are all good, positive things. What happened in India then, again, I'm using India because of Cary, that's where he started. In India, for example, the missionaries spent about 70 years, the vast majority of missionaries, and again, a lot of them were Anglican, the majority of them would be Anglican, teaching English and science and political thought and all those kinds of things, because they were trying to recreate a society that looked something like England. But guess what resulted from this approach to missions? Instead of indigenous churches worshiping in their own language, what we now have is in India, Hindus who speak English and understand the system well enough to get a job in the government, but the vast majority of them did not respond to the gospel. It wasn't the major thing they were taught. So we see, to me, this seems like a huge sidetrack away from the core missionary task if we look at the Pauline model. And these people generally weren't so much looking at that. They were looking back to a denomination in a predominantly Christian country back in Europe. Then we get to the early 1900s, especially after World War I, that ends around 1918. Liberal theology began to undermine confidence in the gospel. And that's partly because of the history. In World War I, Christian nations, again, the Germans and the French and the English were all fighting each other, and they killed millions of themselves and civilians. And that was an embarrassment. They up to that point, they've been saying, well, Christian civilization and Christian nations are more moral and better than the rest of the world. And this really proved that that wasn't actually true. Many Christians at this time had been post-millennial. They thought that they were sort of bringing in the kingdom of God through their works and through all their goodness. And during that war, they were shocked by their own evil. So by the 1920s, the churches that today we call the mainline churches, we should stop that because they're not mainline anymore. But the mainline churches define missions as doing humanitarian work. We will show them the gospel of Jesus through our actions was the primary thought at that time. And many of them considered it wrong to proclaim the gospel and ask for conversion. So what do you think might have resulted from this approach? Well, they did some good things. Again, they set up hospitals and built schools, and they helped people in practical ways. But they were not leading people to faith in Jesus Christ. They were not sharing the gospel with people who had never heard. And because they quit doing it, then in many cases, the national churches that they had established previously all around the world largely lost their evangelistic focus and largely lost their impetus to start new churches. This actually just undermined decades of work that had been done back in the 19th century. So it's just a tragedy. And again, I think anybody who has looked seriously at Paul would say, well, this is way off track from what Paul showed us to do and taught us to do. So then we're walking through recent mission history. So then we come to the end of colonialism. Essentially, colonialism died in the Second World War. Again, it was shown that European nations had no higher moral ground from which they should be ruling most of the world. And so there was this move towards the end of missions because missions had been tied to colonialism in the minds and hearts, especially of people from state churches. I think Baptists and nonconformists like us didn't see it that way because we're not a part of a state church. And beginning around 1930 through 1970, there were many, including people who were missions leaders, who started to call for the end of missions. What they saw there were national churches around the world in so many countries, and they were sort of in some ways maybe still under foreign control, and that might have been financial control. And it just seemed outdated, and it was. In fact, they never should have even gone there at all, but that's what was happening. So in some places, a lot of places actually, the missions that remained moved from being over the churches, which again, as a Baptist, I could never be in favor of, to being under the church in those local areas. So missionaries went and basically served the churches that were there in the denominations. Properties and institutions that had been started by the missionaries were transferred over to local believers. And sadly, what we can see at this point in history is that the churches that received the most in terms of wealth and properties and institutions usually turned out to be the slowest growing churches in those nations until today, because they were just maintaining something that had been given to them before instead of moving with vision on their own. So missions turned to serving the churches that were already established. That is, again, it's a little bit more of a pastoral model, but it's certainly not the pioneer church planting, I want to go where Christ is not known approach that we see so clearly in Paul. Missionaries became denominational servants, and that was seen as an example of humility. And certainly missionaries need to be humble, but what it did was it completely gutted the whole emphasis on the missionaries staying on the edge, going to the lost, presenting the gospel to those who've never heard, and planting churches where there were no churches. And so I sort of already told you that the results of this approach usually was a move away from evangelism, discipleship, and church planting. And mission agencies. There's a lot of mission agencies that just went to humanitarian work or just doing whatever the local denomination was asking them to do. And that usually wasn't the mission task that we see so clearly in Paul.